Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil supply cut off in a single move, global energy markets in panic, oil prices spiking toward record highs, and Iran thought they had just played their strongest card. The one move that would bring the West to its knees and force negotiations on Tehran's terms. They were wrong. Because what America just did to break that blockade wasn't in any playbook Iran had studied. It wasn't a military assault. It wasn't a negotiated settlement. It was something nobody saw coming. And in the next few minutes, you're going to see exactly what happened. Why Iran's entire Hormuz strategy just collapsed, and what this means for the future of global energy security. Before we continue, thanks for tuning in. Your support keeps this channel going. Please subscribe and like the video so more people see this critical analysis. Now let's get into it. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage of water separating Iran from the Arabian Peninsula. At its narrowest point, it's only 21 miles wide, and through that tiny choke point flows roughly 21 million barrels of oil per day. That represents about 1/5 of global petroleum consumption. Every major economy on Earth depends on that waterway staying open. Japan imports nearly all of its energy through Hormuz. South Korea, China, India, all critically dependent. Europe gets a significant portion of its oil and gas from Gulf producers, and it all has to pass through that strait. The United States has spent decades building a military presence in the region, specifically to guarantee that passage remains open. Aircraft carriers, destroyer groups, air bases in Qatar, Bahrain, the UAE, billions of dollars in infrastructure and positioning designed around one core strategic objective: keep Hormuz open. Iran knows this, and for years, Iranian military planners have understood that closing Hormuz is the ultimate leverage play. If you can shut down that waterway, you can hold the global economy hostage. Oil prices spike, energy shortages cascade through industrial economies. Political pressure builds in every capital city from Washington to Tokyo, and suddenly, Iran has negotiating power that no amount of sanctions or military threats can match. That's the theory. And in early March 2026, Iran decided to test it. Following the joint U.S.-Israeli strikes that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, Iran announced a conditional closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies would be turned back or sunk. Iranian naval forces positioned anti-ship missiles along the coast, fast attack boats deployed in the strait. Mines were laid in key shipping channels, and within 48 hours, commercial traffic through Hormuz dropped from over 100 vessels per day to single digits. Tanker traffic effectively stopped. Ships sat anchored outside the strait, unwilling to risk passage. Insurance companies declared the route a war zone, which meant premiums spiked to levels that made shipping economically impossible, even if the physical risk could be managed. Oil prices surged. Brent crude climbed from around $70 a barrel before the conflict to over $100 within a week. Some analysts were projecting $150 if the closure held for more than a few weeks. Gas prices in the United States jumped by over 40 cents per gallon in a matter of days. European governments faced the prospect of energy shortages heading into spring with summer demand looming. Asian economies began emergency stockpile drawdowns. The global economic impact was immediate and severe. And Iran's message was clear. This pain continues until American forces leave the region and the war ends on our terms. For about 72 hours, it looked like Iran had successfully executed the ultimate geopolitical checkmate. The United States had three obvious options, none of them good. Option 1, launch a massive military operation to forcibly reopen the strait. This would require striking Iranian coastal defenses, clearing mines, and establishing a sustained naval presence in contested waters. Casualties would be significant. The operation would take weeks, and there was no guarantee it would work because Iran could continue launching anti-ship missiles and deploying mines faster than the U.S. could clear them. Option 2, negotiate. Accept Iran's terms, agree to a ceasefire, pull back forces, and reopen the strait through diplomatic concession. This would be a massive geopolitical humiliation. It would signal that Iran's leverage was more powerful than American military might, and it would set a precedent that closing Hormuz works as a strategy, which would guarantee future attempts. Option 3, wait it out. Accept the economic pain, draw down strategic petroleum reserves, and hope that domestic pressure inside Iran forces them to reopen the strait before Western economies collapse. This was a gamble with enormous stakes, because if Western economies broke first, the political consequences would be catastrophic for every government involved. None of these options were acceptable. And that's why what happened next was so significant, because the United States didn't choose any of them. Instead, America did something that hadn't been seriously considered as viable until it happened. The U.S. activated an emergency energy corridor that bypassed Hormuz entirely. Here's how it worked. Saudi Arabia has a pipeline called the East-West Pipeline, also known as Petroline. It runs 746 miles from oil fields in the eastern province across the entire country to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. That pipeline was built decades ago, specifically as a Hormuz bypass option. But it had never been used at full capacity because shipping through Hormuz was cheaper and more efficient. The pipeline's maximum capacity is about 5 million barrels per day. Under normal conditions, it operates at maybe 2 million barrels per day, moving oil to domestic refineries and regional markets. The United States worked with Saudi Arabia to immediately ramp Petroline to maximum capacity. Every available barrel that would have normally shipped through Hormuz was redirected to the pipeline and sent to Yanbu on the Red Sea. FROM there. Tankers could load and sail through the Suez Canal to European and American markets without ever entering the Persian Gulf. But 5 million barrels per day is only a quarter of what normally flows through Hormuz. So the U.S. activated a second route. The UAE operates the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, which runs from Abu Dhabi to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, outside the Strait of Hormuz. That pipeline can handle about 1.5 million barrels per day. It was pushed to maximum capacity. Oil that would normally ship through Hormuz was routed through Fujairah instead, bypassing the strait entirely. That gave the coalition 6.5 million barrels per day of alternative routing. Still not enough to replace Hormuz entirely, but enough to take significant pressure off global markets. Then came the third move, and this one was the stroke of strategic genius that Iran never anticipated. The United States coordinated with Iraq to massively increase exports through the Iraq-Turkey pipeline, which runs from northern Iraqi oil fields to the Mediterranean port of Ceyhan in southern Turkey. That pipeline had been operating below capacity for years due to regional instability and maintenance issues. The U.S. provided technical support, security guarantees, and financial incentives to get it running at maximum throughput. An additional 1.6 million barrels per day started flowing to European markets through Turkey, completely bypassing the Persian Gulf. Simultaneously, the U.S. opened its own strategic petroleum reserve for coordinated releases with European and Asian allies. This wasn't just the U.S. dumping oil on the market. This was a synchronized global release designed to stabilize prices and signal to markets that supply would remain adequate even with Hormuz closed. Japan, South Korea, and India all released strategic stocks. The EU activated emergency reserves, and the message to oil markets was clear. The closure of Hormuz will not create the supply crisis Iran is betting on. Within 1 week of Iran closing Hormuz, global oil prices had stabilized. The spike to $100 per barrel reversed. Prices dropped back toward $85. Tanker traffic through alternative routes increased. Refineries adjusted their supply chains, and the pain that Iran thought would be unbearable for Western economies turned out to be manageable. Expensive, yes. Disruptive, absolutely. But not economically crippling. And that changed everything. Because Iran's entire strategy depended on the economic pain being so severe that political pressure would force the U.S. to negotiate. If the pain is manageable, the leverage disappears. And once the leverage disappears, Iran is just sitting on a closed waterway that's costing them their own export revenue while the rest of the world adapts and moves on. Here's the part that made it even worse for Tehran. Every barrel of oil that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iraq exported through alternative routes was a barrel that didn't generate revenue for Iran. Iran's own oil exports, which normally flow through Hormuz, were now stuck. Iranian tankers couldn't leave the Gulf without crossing the very blockade Iran had created. So while Saudi and Emirati oil flowed to global markets through pipelines, Iranian oil sat in storage tanks with nowhere to go. Iran had effectively blockaded itself. The economic damage to Iran's economy was immediate. Oil export revenue is the backbone of the Iranian state budget. Without it, the government can't pay salaries, fund subsidies, or maintain basic services. Within days of the Hormuz closure, reports emerged of unpaid government workers, fuel shortages in Iranian cities, and rationing of basic goods. The population that was supposed to rally behind the government during wartime was instead facing economic collapse caused by their own government's strategy. And the IRGC realized they had miscalculated catastrophically. The assumption had always been that closing Hormuz would hurt the West more than it hurt Iran. The reality was the opposite. The West had alternatives. Iran didn't. The strategic petroleum reserves that the U.S. and allies released weren't just about stabilizing prices. They were a signal, a message that said, we can outlast you. We have reserves. We have alternative routes. We have options. What do you have? And the answer was nothing. Iran had no countermove. They couldn't reopen Hormuz without admitting the strategy had failed. But they couldn't keep it closed without destroying their own economy faster than they were damaging anyone else's. They were trapped by their own blockade. Now, let's talk about why this matters beyond just this one conflict. Because what the United States just demonstrated is a blueprint for neutralizing one of the most powerful geopolitical weapons in existence. For decades, the threat of a Hormuz closure has been the nightmare scenario that shaped American Middle East policy. Massive military presence, billions in defense spending, entire carrier groups positioned in the Gulf, all of it justified by the need to keep that waterway open. Iran just forced the US to prove that the waterway isn't as critical as everyone thought. And now that the alternative routes have been tested and proven functional, the strategic picture has permanently changed. Saudi Arabia now knows that Petroline can operate at full capacity and replace a huge portion of Hormuz traffic. The UAE knows that Fujairah can handle diverted oil flows. Iraq knows that Ceyhan can be a major export route with the right support. These aren't theoretical options anymore. They're proven alternatives. And that means the next time anyone threatens to close Hormuz, whether it's Iran or anyone else, the threat carries less weight. The leverage is diluted. The nightmare scenario has a workaround. And once a geopolitical choke point has a demonstrated bypass, it stops being a choke point. It becomes an inconvenience. This doesn't mean Hormuz doesn't matter. It absolutely still matters. 21 million barrels per day is a massive flow that can't be fully replaced by pipelines. But it does mean that the threat of closure is no longer the existential crisis it once was. And for Iran, that's a disaster, because threatening Hormuz was the last card they had. Now here's where this gets even more interesting. Iran's failure to leverage Hormuz successfully has implications for every other choke point on Earth. The Suez Canal, the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait, the Malacca Strait. Every narrow waterway that global trade depends on is now being looked at differently. If Hormuz can be bypassed, what about the others? Can China's energy imports through Malacca be rerouted if that strait is ever contested? Can European trade through Suez be redirected if Egypt ever threatens closure? The answer is starting to look like yes, with enough planning and investment. And that changes the leverage calculation for every country that sits on a strategic waterway. The power of choke points is eroding. So where does this leave Iran? They're now in an impossible position. The Hormuz closure isn't working, but reopening it without achieving any of their objectives would be a humiliating admission of failure. They can't keep it closed without bankrupting themselves. They can't reopen it without looking weak. And the US knows it, which is why Washington isn't rushing to reopen negotiations. There's no need. The economic pressure is now entirely on Tehran. Every day Hormuz stays closed, Iran loses revenues and the population suffers. Every day the alternative routes prove functional, Iran's leverage weakens further. Time is now on America's side. And that is the ultimate reversal of what Iran thought would happen. This is what happens when you play your strongest card and it turns out the other side had a better hand the whole time. Iran thought Hormuz was checkmate. It turned out to be a bluff that got called. And now the entire region is watching what happens when a choke point strategy fails. Because if Iran can't make Hormuz closure work, who can? Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what just happened. Because the media is covering the closure as if it's a crisis. The reality is, it's a failure. A strategic miscalculation that backfired so badly it might be the thing that ends this war on terms Iran never wanted to accept. Oil is flowing, markets are stable, and Iran is blockading itself into economic collapse. That's not leverage, that's desperation. Thanks for watching. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Iran will reopen Hormuz, or will they keep it closed until their economy breaks? Subscribe for more analysis, and I'll see you in the next one.